Today concludes our 50 years later series. First we landed on the moon, wasn't that fun? Then we went to Woodstock. Today we'll talk about Stonewall. Is everybody here just familiar at least with the concept of Stonewall? So just a moment of context for those of you that aren't. Stonewall is the riot that happened in Greenwich Village on Christopher Street, or near Christopher Street, in 1969, and really is credited with the beginning of the gay liberation movement. And I'll say more about that later, but just in case you weren't familiar, I don't want to start this without you having some idea of what I'm talking about. So like last week, Woodstock did not take place in a vacuum, and neither did Stonewall. Actually, some strides were already being made and shifts happening in the gay community. In 1961, the first openly gay person ran for U.S. public office. It was the drag queen Jose Serrara, running for San Francisco City Supervisor. In 1964, Life magazine ran a positive cover story on homosexuality in America. In 1966, the first U.S. Gay Community Center opens in San Francisco, led by the Society for Individual Rights. In that same year was the first transgendered public uprising at San Francisco's Compton's cafeteria. In 1967, England and Wales legalized male homosexuality. In 1968, the American Psychiatric Association moves homosexuality from sociopathic category to sexual deviation. Small strides. In 68, the Metropolitan Community Church, MCC, began in the living room of Troy Perry, who would go on to be its founder, and soon moved to Encore Theater because it had grown so large. In 1969 was the Stonewall Uprising. Shortly after that, in 1970, the good old Unitarian Universalist Association becomes the first U.S. mainstream religious group to recognize LGBT clergy and laity within its ranks and demands an end to anti-gay discrimination. You with me so far? Yes. That same year, the Vatican issues a statement reiterating that homosexuality is a moral aberration. 1972, the Reverend William Johnson became the first openly gay minister to be ordained in the United Church of Christ. Even though those were some small strides made, the 1960s and before that were like the dark ages for gay people. In 1969, homosexual acts were illegal in every state except for Illinois. Homosexuality was a medical defect, a mental illness, and all homosexuals were portrayed as promiscuous, incapable of long-term relationships or lasting love. In fact, on a controversial documentary in 1967 that Mike Wallace hosted, the statement was made that there is no possibility of a happy homosexual. In Hollywood, where there were a lot of gays, the media portrayed gay men in particular as mentally unstable at best and vilified them as evil at worst. If you want some history of that, I recommend to you the dated but very powerful movie, The Celluloid Closet. Gay men were subjected to electric shock treatments. And really, in general, according to society and the people who lived in it at that time that were gay, one man said being gay was the worst possible thing you could be. What I want you to understand about all this is that it wasn't just the time of that, but for gay and lesbian people, there were no rites of passages, no rituals, no proms, no social support or approval for their relationships. LGBT people were not protected by the law, by the Constitution, and many times not by their families either. If you were arrested, your name was listed in the newspaper, and you could lose your job. You were, quote, outed, although that's the term we use now because at that time there was no such thing as out. The law on the books at that time was one known homosexual presence in a group could deem that group disorderly. We'd be in big trouble in this room, wouldn't we? You couldn't be a doctor, a teacher, a lawyer, and be obvious in any way. Oh yeah, you couldn't be a minister either. Gay people at that time were often called twilight people because they only came out after dark. And many of these attitudes were religiously fueled. And certainly the church was not a sanctuary. It was not a refuge. But actually, truthfully, it was one of the least safe places you could be. So it makes sense that bars would become the center of gay social life. One person said gay bars were to gay people what black churches were to the South. I'm going to say that one more time. I think it's so important to understand. Gay bars were to gay people what black churches were to the South. In fact, the Metropolitan Community Church of San Francisco, where I served for 12 years as their senior minister, began in a bar on Jackson Street in 1972. And in that bar they gathered and they shared communion. There's not a lot of people left who were there that night. And perhaps because that's the way it is when you remember, or just because gay people are so dramatic. You can laugh, it's okay. It's true. We're proud of it. There's no one real story of what happened that night. The details vary depending on who tells it, who wants to be the hero or heroine. What matters is that it happened. And people remember it in their own way because they made meaning out of it. A couple months ago, in celebration of the 50th anniversary, there was an incredible article by Louis Lucero II called Memories of That Night. And he found a few people who were there and told their story. Very early on Saturday, June 28, 1969, something happened at the Stonewall Inn. Even though the question of what to call it, like most details of that night, is a matter of disagreement. All right, let me go back. I missed the page. Can I just say something really authentically and honestly to you? It's very vulnerable for me to be talking about this. So it may not feel emotional to you, but it's really vulnerable. Thank you. And I don't mean this to be a therapeutic moment in any way. I'm fine. But I just, like, reading about all this stuff really brought up a lot that I've experienced and that I've watched people experience and that people still experience today. So if you will just bear with my emotion, I'll get to a good part at the end, I promise. So one of the people that he interviewed in that article, Martin Boyce, first thing he said was, never wear heels because you had to run. Evading police harassment was a fact of life for gay people like Martin Boyce. Many of the unwanted interactions were predicated on a criminal statute allowing for the arrest of anyone not wearing at least 3 articles of gender-appropriate clothing. And socks didn't count, Martin said. According to Martin, the routine police stops, regular attempts at entrapment, and raids of establishments frequented by gays all contributed to an atmosphere in which being gay meant feeling hunted. He said, we all had our list in our heads of friends who were beaten, maimed, thrown out of their house, informed on by the cops, tragic stories, he said, but there was nothing you could do about it. The bar also drew an unusually diverse crowd. Stonewall was like a Noah's Ark, Mr. Boyce said. Its patrons exhibited degrees of loudness, going from drag queens down to professionals. Mark Siegel, who was also there that night, said it was a safe place for us. When you walked in the door of Stonewall, you could hold hands, you could kiss, and more importantly, you could dance. It was church in a particular kind of way. Stan Higgs texted me early yesterday morning and said Stonewall was happening when I was a junior in high school. I then realized I'm not the only one, and I'll never forget it. It was 1991 when I walked into my first women's or lesbians bar in San Francisco, the Metro Bar on Market Street. The first week I had moved to San Francisco, and I walked in, and I thought, oh, now I know what it means to feel at home. It was probably the first time in my life I wasn't aware of being slightly different. Stonewall Inn was a seedy bar, by all accounts, owned by the mafia. Of course. They saw money-making opportunities, so they watered down the drinks, hiked up the prices, because it was the only place, the gay bars in that area were the only place that gay people could go. And the Stonewall Inn had been raided many times before, but that night, instead of being on the defense, they were defiant. The drag queens and all the rest of them. That night, they said, the police ran from us. Think of it for a moment. The world turned upside down. The police ran from drag queens. They ran from sissies. They ran from the fags. And what did they use? Anything they could get their hands on. Beer bottles, bricks, pennies, cans. I'm sure one or two high heels went through a window. They can be lethal, let me tell you. So on that morning, something happened. Even the question of what to call it, like most details of that night, is a matter of disagreement. And although historians prefer the term uprising, the men that were there that night did not shy away from calling the events of that night a riot. Jim Farrar, who was also interviewed, said, get this, he preferred to think of it as an internal rebellion, one in which his internalized homophobia flew away. So whatever happened that night, it was the start of a new era. It was a blueprint for gay activists, one that urged outspoken defiance against homophobic and transphobic forces. It's credited as the beginning of the gay liberation movement and the flourishing of community centers, advocacy, and marches. Stonewall was not just an event. People made meaning from it, and thinking began to shift. I want to say that Stonewall was about visibility, empowerment, liberation, and standing up for yourself against a society who would rather you didn't survive. Kind of like the text this morning. The Canaanite woman. She comes to Jesus, and she had enough. She was at the end of her rope. She shouted, she begged, she pleaded. You know why? Because she had nothing left to lose. Jesus, what did he do? He remained silent. His disciples said, get rid of her. She's shouting. She's making a nuisance. Then finally, when Jesus does reply to her, did you catch it? It's uncomfortable. He's like, woman, no, that's not my job. I'm for the house of Israel. You're a Canaanite. I'm not going to take the children's bread and give it to the dogs. Jesus was culturally bound by his time. But she wouldn't take no. She became defiant. And she said, now don't picture this in some little whispered, demurred, pleading voice. Picture it with all the strength of a mother bear. And she said, well, even the dogs, Jesus, get crumbs from the table. And what was his response? Something shifted in him in that moment. And he said, woman, great is your faith. And then, that unclean spirit that was with her daughter, whatever that means, was gone. Isn't it interesting that the moment that Jesus himself is freed from his cultural boundaries, that her daughter was freed? Because the prejudices that put people down aren't just in people that are put down, it's in the people that put them down. And when one of us is freed, all of us are free. And that's the truth. And that's the miracle of this story. Is that Jesus was freed to see every person as worthy. Great is your faith. Because faith is something you experience. Great is your faith, woman, because faith speaks up. Faith challenges. Faith is fashioned out of the experience of your life. Faith believes God has my back. I will speak up. I am not less than anybody else. I'm a child of God. I'm beloved. I am worthy. And I am deserving of respect, and I am deserving of resources. And when I have something to say, I'm going to say it. Faith says, I will not let anyone, especially in God's name, tell me I am less than. In this story, it is the woman's faith that wins the day. Her faith, which looked in that moment like defiance, allowed conversion to happen. Allowed Jesus and perhaps his disciples to break out of their cultural, religious, and social boundaries. Anybody with me up there? Ooh, when you get that quiet. Okay. Okay, I'm going to end really happy. Stonewall impacted Christianity and the church dramatically. So out of the ashes rose a beautiful phoenix. It brought liberation to many of us. Gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer, and the alphabet goes on and on. Bring great gifts to the church and to faith. I just named 3. I think we brought a new way of looking at family, a kinship that transcends biological ties. And that's been a great gift to anybody who's part of any family that looks different than the one defined by the norm. I think we've brought the freedom to be, whether it's your gender identity or just who you are. I think gay people have helped the church see that Jesus met people exactly where they were, and there wasn't one way of being that was better than another. And I think that the gay community has brought a faith that is liberating, an open communion, a table that is free from any social or cultural boundaries, full citizenship in the family of God. So, dear friends, if it weren't for Stonewall, if it weren't for people who were courageous on whose shoulders I stand today, if it weren't for drag queens who took off the heel and threw it. Many of us, this particular constellation of people, would not be in this room today. We would not know the kind of freedom, or I believe the inclusive welcome that we have come to treasure so deeply. So today, whether gay or straight or bi or undefined, how has Stonewall impacted you? You know and love people who are now free to be themselves. And we know and love people, and we are free to be ourselves in a way that has been transformational. And never take for granted what a few defiant drag queens can do in the world. And never underestimate the power and the transformation of welcome and seeing people for who they really are. So blessed be Stonewall. Amen.